Thank you everyone for joining us today in our complimentary webinar series for U.S. federal government contractors. We are coming to you live today from Washington, D.C. You probably found out about today's webinar through our newsletter, which reaches over 23,000 federal government contractors and service providers. Today's session is complimentary and also recorded. You can find the recordings on our website and YouTube channel about 24 hours after the webinar. We have over 525 complimentary webinars on our YouTube channel. This includes all 52 parts of the FAR and all 52 parts of the DFAR and hundreds of webinars on strategic and tactical topics. If you would like to advertise in our newsletter or in any of our upcoming webinars, please email hello@jenniferschaus.com. A little bit about us. We are a specialized consulting firm focused on working with established federal contractors. We work with product, service, and software firms across the globe. For more information about our services, please visit our website and select About Us. As mentioned, today's webinar is covering the FAR supplements. It is complimentary and recorded. We began this series in January 2022, and you can find these past recordings on our website as well as future schedule with recording registration links. As you can see here, we have covered several of the FAR supplements already and will wind down this series on August 24th with the Veterans Administration. Then on Fridays, we cover the same agency or department in a Playbook series. The Friday webinars discuss upcoming bidding opportunities, contracting trends, small business resources, and sometimes feature a government speaker. The full schedule and past recordings are on our website under the Playbook tab. Please join us at the Kennedy Center for a night of networking with over 200 federal contractors. Our quarterly event will take place on Monday, June 20th. Sponsorship opportunities are available. Federal agencies will be present and will be listed as they confirm. Please note that ticket prices increase on June 13th. We hope to see you there. Now we'd like to thank our sponsors who help make this webinar series possible. We'd like to thank the Virginia Ptac. The Virginia Ptac is based out of GMU in Fairfax and offers free one-on-one counseling to firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. If you are interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore what Ptacs can offer. And a special thanks to the Federal Business Council. The FBC creates and manages virtual and in-person meetings and events to connect appropriate industry and government thought leaders, product providers, and solutions with government programs that use them. The FBC works within mission-specific programs for a variety of agencies to connect government and industry in the form of in-person and virtual conferences, training events, policy dialogue, and outreach. Over the last 40+ years, FBC has become a comprehensive resource for connecting industry and federal government. DASTN is an IT and cloud solutions provider working with corporations, the military, and government agencies to lower their costs, increase scalability, improve operational efficiency, and meet compliance regulations using targeted cloud-based solutions. DASTN is a certified partner of Oracle NetSuite, a premier tier Google Cloud partner, and a certified partner of Cisco, Virtue, AODocs, and Authenticate. For more information about DASTN services or to schedule a complimentary consultation, please email Joe Alsim. His contact information is in the lower left corner of your slide. You can also visit the DASTN website. Government white papers, finding a reliable online source for keeping up with government tech trends and regulations can be overwhelming and time-consuming. Gov White Papers is a free and easy-to-use resource for the public sector and supporting industries to find and share government and military-related content, saving your time in serving your country. Topics include Homeland Security, international commerce, cybersecurity, supply chain, AI, and much more. Gain peace of mind understanding trends and technologies to modernize and run your organization efficiently while streamlining technology adoption. Claim your free membership on govwhitepapers.com today to access thousands of government and military ebooks, white papers, infographics, and case studies with fresh content added daily. Thank you again to the attendees and our speaker for joining us today in our FAR Supplement series. We are all here today to dig into the FAR Supplement on the Department of State. Our speaker today is Devin Hewitt, and she represents the firm Pertore. As a reminder, we do not take any questions, so if you have questions for Devin, her contact information will be displayed at the end of the presentation, and you can contact her directly. Thank you, Devin, for joining us today. I'll put myself on mute and wait for your cue for the next slide. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me. This is my fourth, I think, FAR supplement presentation. And I think I'll first explain my approach. Typically, FAR supplements don't supplement the FAR considerably. What I found is that for the most part, the supplement just addresses who within the agency has the authority to take various actions that are referred to in the FAR. So when I go through the FAR supplement, I really look to see what may be in the supplement that would affect contractors and or what contractors might find interesting that would affect their business. And often that isn't very much. So what I like to also do is look at other aspects of that agency's contracting that would be interesting to contractors. And I've often found that what's most interesting to contractors is not what's in the supplement or what's in the FAR, but rather what's in internal agency guidance, standard operating practices, internal memos, etc. And also knowing various acquisition structures and delegations of authority, which sometimes is very hard to find on the website, etc. It's also interesting. And while it may be addressed in the FAR supplement, it often is very cryptic. So I take a little bit more of a holistic approach to these seminars by looking at all of that and talking about it. I was particularly interested in doing this one because I'm actually a Foreign Service brat, and I grew up in the Foreign Service and know a lot about the State Department. And in fact, I married a Foreign Service officer, although I'm divorced now, but have had experience dealing with the State Department as an adult. And I've also done a number of government contract matters with the State Department, including various protests. So I've had quite a bit of experience from all sides with the Department of State. So I guess I feel I'm quite qualified to address this topic. And while I'm certainly familiar with a lot of the acronyms, if nothing else. So let's start. Next slide, please. So here is the acquisition organization within state. It's all under the Undersecretary of Management. And what I want to first point out is that there is a separate bureau for overseas building operations and a Bureau of Administration. I think it's important to point this out because let's think about the function of the Department of State. The majority of the facilities, and therefore the bulk of contracting dollars for which the Department of State is going to be responsible, is going to be overseas, right? It's going to be in connection with their embassies and their consulates around the world. Now, the government, the State Department has facilities, in visa and consular operations in the United States, and obviously a building, downtown. But for, general contracting dollars, the bulk of those are going to be spent abroad and in connection with their embassy compounds and consulates. And certainly for construction of those and modifications and repair, that is going to be the province of the OBO and not the Bureau of Administration. And as you will see going through the supplement and elsewhere, that is a significant divvying up of the Department of State's contracting dollars and the way those dollars are spent and the authority for those dollars and the regulations that apply to those dollars. So that's an important distinction that I think is worth pointing out. I'm going to focus on the Bureau of Administration because, as you will see, much of what happens overseas is exempt. But where that occurs, the supplement does point it out, and I will as well. So when we're talking about acquisitions that are not subject to OBO, they are under the Bureau Administration and under the Office of the Procurement Executive. And when the agency head is referred to in the FAR, that means the Office of the Procurement Executive. However, that title has been delegated to the Assistant Secretary of State for Administration. And under that rubric, there is the Office of Acquisitions Policy and the Office of Acquisitions Management. Now, the Office of Acquisitions Policy does what it implies. It issues policies on procurement and develops regulations and vets those regulations and policies and implements policies that are congressional, White House based, etc. But the nuts and bolts of acquisitions comes under the Office of Acquisitions Management. They manage, plan, direct states' acquisition programs, and they conduct all kinds of contract operations support. And that means, doing market research, drafting RFPs, running the procurements, and providing post-contract award support. So that's the office that does what we all know is the sort of day-to-day nuts and bolts of federal contracting for the Department of State. Next slide. So the baseline regulation that applies to Department of State acquisitions is the FAR as supplemented by the Department of State Acquisition Regulation Supplement, known as, well, as I call it, the DOSAR, but perhaps there's another pronunciation, but it's certainly spelled DOSAR, and I'm just calling it the DOSAR. And like all other supplements, it's divided into the same parts, subparts, and sections as the FAR is. If there is no supplementary guidance, there will be no content in that section. So, for example, if there is a provision in Part 6 of the FAR, the prefix will be Part 603 of the DOSAR. And the DOSAR is applicable to all Department of State acquisitions of personal property and services, including construction, in and outside the United States, unless it's explicitly excluded in the DOSAR or exempt by statute. And the DOSAR lists a number of statutes, many statutes. But I point out here one of them, the Foreign Service Buildings Act, because as the name of this statute implies, it applies to building embassies and consulates abroad. So again, that indicates to you that many, if not all, of the FAR and DOSAR provisions will not apply to the construction, repair, and alteration of embassy and consulate facilities abroad. Next slide. But is that all? And as I indicated, it is not all. Much of what happens on a day-to-day basis with regard to acquisition is also addressed in something called the Department of State's Foreign Affairs Manual, known as the FAM. And I highlight here certain areas of the FAM that talk about various activities related to acquisition and procurement. For example, Volume 1 of the FAM, under Organization and Functions, there's a section entitled Internal Functional Bureaus, the Bureau of Administration, which I referred to in the first slide, talks about the authority of various sub officials and sub offices. Then Chapter 14, General Acquisitions, has subsections on how to do advanced acquisition planning. It has a section on performance-based statements of work. There's a section on logistics management, on requirements planning and use. There's a contracting officers representative handbook. So a lot of standard operating procedures and gritty detail is really not in the FAR supplement, but in this Foreign Affairs manual, and then the handbooks referenced therein. So I'm letting you know about this. So if some peculiar or troubling incident arise in contracting with the Department of State, if it's not answered in the FAR and not answered in the DOSAR, it may be answered or can be referred to in the FAM. Next slide. Another source of procurement guidance when contracting with the Department of State can be found at the OSBU office. And the context here is certainly a little bit more broad, but I offer it up as just information that may be useful. What I found here that was useful for contractors is that the Department of State actually has an order of precedent for its small business goals. As you know, the government, government-wide has small business goals it's trying to reach. And then each agency has small business goals and subcontracting goals. And SBA scores every agency annually on its success or lack of success in meeting its stated goals. Well, for fiscal year 2022, the order of preference that the Department of State has announced is WOSBs and WOSBs are the most important, then SDVOSBs and hub zones, and then small disadvantaged business. That's interesting because that allows contractors to try to encourage the agencies to set aside, when the government is contemplating a set aside small business procurements for WOSBs or EDWOSBs. The other item of interest for small businesses intending to do business with the government is that the OSBU link on the Department of State website does have a link entitled Doing Business with the Department of State Small Business Resources. And while that's interesting why that is interesting is that they have links underneath it. And one of which I think is quite interesting is the State Department telephone directory. Well, frankly, you can never find anybody's telephone number anywhere. And whether they actually pick up the phone is another question entirely, but it's great to have somebody's telephone directory. So that's in there. They also have facility security clearances facts. And as you know, security clearances are of a particular concern with small businesses generally, certainly at the State Department, and DSS is right there and will be doing much of the review of security clearances. So it's good that they have those facts. They also have a list of the State Department's large prime contractors and their liaison officers, and they have a little, a little squib there about how small businesses can do business abroad. So there is content there that seems useful for doing business with the State Department and useful to contracting. That again, I think informs this whole holistic approach of how the government or how the agency does business with contractors. Next slide. All right, let's start getting into these parts of the DOSAR. The general, very first part, the general talks about delegations of authority. It states that each overseas post is a contracting activity, and so can contract on its own, but the embassy official, which is generally the management officer, must have the appropriate warrant. However, embassies cannot enter into cost reimbursement, fixed price incentive, or fixed price redeterminative contracts. Any design build solicitations must be approved by OBO, not surprising given what I've told you previously. And construction contracts and A&E contracts exceeding $500,000 must be approved by the Office of the Procurement Executive. Again, this relates back to construction and building contracts being subject to the province of OBO and exempt from the FAR and DOSAR by the Foreign Affairs Building Act. Now, there are a number of further delegations in this part of the DOSAR. They're like 20. I just mentioned a couple here just to give you a flavor of how these delegations and what they are. So, for example, there's a delegation to the Office of Overseas Schools to contract for a number of things, to the Office of Language Services to contract for a number of things under certain levels, and similarly to the U.S. mission to the United Nations. So it goes to show you that there are, given an embassy houses a number of different agencies and is the location for a number of different purposes of the U.S. government, there are delegations that come not only through the Department of State Office of Administration, they also come through the OBO, they also come through other statutes. And so the delegation of what typically would be contracting authority that goes through the Assistant Secretary down through the Office of the Procurement Executive is further delegated pursuant to these other authorities to these other offices. Again, it gets back to, it's nice to know who has authority to do what and how that flows down to these various local or lower level offices. Next slide. Part 3 of the FAR, improper business practices and personal conflicts of interest. The only thing I thought that was particularly interesting in the DOSAR was that it explicitly states that it is the policy of the Department of State not to award contracts to federal employees or businesses substantially owned or controlled by federal employees. And that also applies to individuals hired under personal services agreements or contracts. Next slide. Administrative matters. With regard to contract closeout procedures, contracting officers are required to have an audit done for cost reimbursement contracts over $550,000. And unbeknownst to me, the Department of State has a procurement quality assurance program. It applies only to domestic contracting, but it requires first to have a peer review by a quote unquote, a qualified contracting professional. And between you and me, I didn't know the Department of State had any qualified contracting professional. Okay, just kidding. For contracting actions above the simplified acquisition threshold. And the legal advisor for buildings acquisitions must review contract actions and orders against the schedules exceeding $1 million if there are any sort of issues. And the legal advisor buildings acquisitions also reviews non-personal services contracting actions awarded to a U.S. citizen. Next slide. Publishing contracting actions. Okay, foreign acquisitions. Again, this is going to be different than domestic acquisitions. The overseas contracting activities, i.e. consulates, embassies, do not need to use a government-wide portal, whether that's FBO or whatever it's called now, to advertise for foreign acquisitions by overseas activities, but they're still required to ensure competition. and they must include the U.S. firms and these overseas procurements if they know the U.S. firm's interest, the U.S. firm is somehow affiliated or connected to the locality and is otherwise capable of providing the required supplies or services. Now, there's an exception for local guard services contracts with a value in excess of $250,000 or other contracts with a value in excess of $5 million. Those are going to be publicized just like any other solicitation or requirement is publicized. Next slide. Competition requirements. There is, and this is a theme that I discovered when going through the supplement. There are a lot of contracts for guard services because there are a lot of embassy and consulates around the world, and they all need to be guarded, and those are 24/7 requirements, and depending on the size and the number of consulates or other embassy outposts in a country, this is a very not only important but costly contract. And while it seems it wouldn't be too technically complicated, they can be, given the quality of the personnel, given the experience requirements, and given some of the challenges of host nations. So there is a lot of focus on embassy guard contracts, and indeed I've been involved in a lot of protests involving them. So through the DOSAR, you will see mention of guard contracts quite a bit, and you certainly don't see that in other agency supplements. So here is one example. We just saw the other example about publicizing contract actions. Here, there is a mention in the DOSAR about guard services should only be procured from the host nation when the host nation is the only source of personnel for the guard services. The DOSAR also addresses the internal agency advocates for competition. There's an acquisition ombudsman, and with respect to posts overseas, the management officers, the advocate for competition. For other acquisitions, that would be for the Office of Acquisition Management or the regional procurement support offices. I think it is the acquisition ombudsman, although nobody really names the person, they use these titles. I looked on the website and ostensibly it is Ms. Sharon James, although to be honest, I don't know if it's really that up to date, but the email address has seemed to be constant, and that's CAT, I think it's competition advocate something, at state.gov. I mean, good luck with that. But presumably if somebody really wants to get a hold of them, there might be a way, or I could find out who that is. Next slide. All right, the small business programs. The domestic acquisitions are subject to the Small Business Act and subject to the requirements in FAR Part 19 and DOSAR Part 619. But compliance with the Act and the regulations by overseas contracting activities is voluntary. The OSPU is tasked by the DOSAR for ensuring compliance with the Small Business Act. According to the website, George Price is the director, although I found recently things are not quite up to date. And I say that because the regulation on the ECFR website, which says it's up to date as of today, with respect to the DOSAR, talks about the Department of State Mentor Protege program. But I will tell you that that Mentor Protege program no longer exists. When SBA adopted its all small Mentor Protege program, the Department of State wound down its Mentor Protege program and now just relies on and accepts the mentor-protege agreements and ventures associated with those agreements that SBA approves. But if you look in the DOSAR, there are a lot of regulations regarding Departments of State's mentor-protege program. Just saying. I was referring earlier to the prime contracting goals that the Department of State has in the order of precedence or priorities, WOSB being first. For fiscal year 2022, the prime contracting goals are, as I set forth here. Of note, for fiscal year 2020, which is, I think, the most recent data available, the Department of State got an A+ for exceeding the goals that it had set for itself for fiscal year 2020, it was because it exceeded those goals, and its goals, I think, are the same, if not greater than the overall government-wide goals. So, it's doing well by its own count. Although how that really shakes out, I don't really know, to be honest. And again, how that plays out over contracts that are domestic and only apply to the limited contracting dollars that apply, to acquisitions within the United States, as opposed to the exponentially greater number of acquisitions that apply to the Department of State's facilities overseas, really is an A+ warranted. I'll leave that to the audience to ruminate about. Next slide. Well, with regard to small business subcontracting, there is a stated policy in the DOSAR to incorporate the agency's current year fiscal subcontracting goals into solicitations for prime contractors to use in developing their subcontracting plans. And the subcontracting goals are 42% for small businesses generally, 5% for each for SDBs, and then WOSB, EDWOSB together, and SDVOSB and hub zones each 3%. The DOSAR encourages the use of an incentive clause for a prime having these goals in its subcontracting plan, provided the funds are available to provide that incentive. It also encourages contracting officers to use a clause in the solicitation that evaluates a prime contractor's adequacy of its subcontracting plan or past performance in achieving its subcontracting goals. And the DOSAR Part 619 also requires the contracting officer to collect data on the prime contractor's subcontracting practices and success in meeting the subcontracting plan goals. Next slide. Bonds and insurance. Typically, this is not a big area where agencies supplement the FAR, but not surprisingly, here there is a supplement because of the work that of the agency that's done quite a bit abroad. And in this respect, the DOSAR addresses Defense-Based Act insurance, also known in the industry as DBA insurance. Under the DOSAR, DBA insurance applies to acquisitions for services, which includes construction but does not include personal services, overseas for certain covered employees. And the DOSAR defines covered employees to include U.S. citizens or residents or other individuals hired in the U.S., but it doesn't apply to independent contractors, individuals who are self-employed. It applies to employees of contractors who are, put on the payroll of a contractor. Now, there are exceptions. There are the DBA doesn't need to be acquired for local nationals or third country nationals, but they have to be provided workers' compensation benefits that address war hazard injury, death, capture, or detention, or are afforded those sort of protections if there are local workers' compensation laws. If not, then Dba Insurance or the like has to be procured for them. And it doesn't apply to employees that are employed for a part-time basis, which I think is 90 days at a time. There's a definition of these employees in the DOSAR. So, just note to self, DBA may apply to acquisitions to contractor employees abroad, depending on a variety of factors, which are listed in DOSAR Part 628. Next slide. Protest disputes and appeals. Interesting fact. The agency has, by reading Part 633 of the DOSAR, what could be a robust ADR program, which would apply to contract disputes. It doesn't apply to protests, but it applies to a dispute that or a claim that's filed by a contractor pursuant to the Contract Disputes Act with the contracting officer. And typically you submit a claim and you request a contracting officer's decision. And the DOSAR outlines this ADR program that should be considered. It's not required to be considered, but it should be considered by the contracting officer before he or she issues his or her final decision. And the program that is outlined in the DOSAR is fairly robust. Now, what's interesting is the should. The DOSAR actually has a pros and cons list that the contracting officer should consider in determining whether ADR is appropriate. It includes a list of factors that are in favor of engaging in ADR and a list of factors that disfavor engaging in ADR. But if ADR is favored, there are a variety of mechanisms that are authorized by the DOSAR, and they include what I've mentioned here, using a settlement judge, having a mini trial, having a summary trial with a binding decision, which is sort of like an expedited appeal to the Civilian Board of Contract Appeals, having a mediation, having an arbitration. And then there's something here called partnering, which, gave me a little bit of a giggle because I looked at it and I go, what is that? And the definition of partnering acknowledged that it wasn't really an ADR mechanism, but an approach designed to develop a quote unquote, a cooperative attitude in completing a government contract. And I thought, well, that's novel. The government and the contractor developing a cooperative attitude. And apparently this partnering concept involves writing something down where there would be goals that the parties would try to reach. And, it's a lot of and you, and really unbelievable that this would even be put in writing, and probably more unbelievable that anybody would even engage in it. But again, just saying. Next slide, please. All right, well, here's where the rubber meets the road in terms of where the acquisition dollars are spent and where the authority and the FAR and the DOSAR depart on the nature of the contract. So FAR Part 36 addresses construction and the architect engineer contracts, and clearly Part 636 is the DOSAR supplement. So as I indicated earlier, the Foreign Service Buildings Act allows exemptions from the FAR for overseas construction, repair, alteration to Department of State facilities, which are primarily embassies and consulates. Now, in that regard, American-owned firms receive a 10% price preference price reduction on those procurements, of course, provided that there are 2 offerors that bid or submit offers. Now, the Act limits competition for the construction, repair, alteration of Department of State facilities above $5 million to U.S. firms or firms from countries which allow U.S. firms comparable access to, similar projects in their countries. So, friendly countries. Now, unless there are exceptions that are required by international agreement or the laws of a host country are waived by the state. But stated another way, we have no problem giving a construction, repair, alteration contract above $5 million to Canada to work on our embassy in Canada, or Great Britain to do our work in Great Britain, etc. Now, under the Omnibus Diplomatic Security and Anti-Terrorism Act, however, U.S. firms must perform construction project in excess of $10 million on our facilities abroad, and abroad, and I think actually in the United States, so our own facilities in the United States. And U.S. firms must perform construction projects involving technical security. And that's, a term of art that's defined in the DOSAR. It's not low-level technology, but I think we all can figure out what kind of technical security might be in an embassy or a consulate. I mean, unless that's prohibited by a host nation, and how that actually gets addressed, I don't know, and then probably if I knew, somebody would have to shoot me. So clearly somebody in the government knows, but I don't. And interestingly that they put this in here, and again, I think this is an important thing for contractors to know, is that a prime contractor cannot subcontract more than 50% of the total value of the contract where it is performing this construction contract in excess of $10 million. Obviously, because they want to make sure, they being the State Department wants to make sure that the contractor that they awarded the contract to is going to do the bulk of work, because they've already screened and they're concerned about who's going to be on that site. Next slide. Oh, well, I'm done. Look at that. Got you out early before the hour's over. Thanks very much for tuning in. I hope you learned something you didn't know before you tuned in. And of course, if you have any specific questions, feel free to reach out. Can't guarantee you that I'll have the answer, but I'll do my best to circle back with you.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you so much, Devin, for a great presentation. Thank you to all who have participated. The recording and slides will be available within 24 hours or less. Just once again, please join us at the Kennedy Center for a night of networking with over 200 federal contractors. Our quarterly event will take place on Monday, June 20th. Sponsorship opportunities are available and federal agencies will be present and will be listed as they confirm. Please note that ticket prices increase on June 13th. We hope to see you there. This concludes our webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.